Bacteria and snail brains aren't things that are typically in the same podcast, but we are going to shoehorn those together today in this episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through yet another story, chronicling the lives of the tiny and the infamous, and that would be, of course, the incredible and the amazing bacteria and all the related microorganisms that surround us and live inside us and exist in the world. I have a really cool story to talk to you guys about today. It has to do with bacteria. It has to deal with the brains of snails, which, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, are things that you would not typically see in the same podcast, but very excited to talk about that. Before we jump into that, though, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube. If you're listening to this podcast on some other kind of podcast medium like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to hit that follow button. It really helps support the channel and really helps support the podcast. Okay, let's jump into the science for today. So we've talked about a whole bunch over the course of this podcast about the influences of bacteria on us, on the human body. There's a whole bunch of different ways that we get influenced by bacteria. Obviously, they influence our immune system, whether or not they are making us sick, or sometimes even if they're supporting our immune system. They influence our gut. They influence the way that we digest things. They're on our skin. They influence whether or not something can colonize on our skin. There's a whole bunch of different ways that bacteria influence us. One that I don't think a lot of folks think about, and maybe you guys have heard about this, but we haven't really emphasized it quite so much in this podcast, is this relationship between the bacteria and the brain, right? You may have heard of this thing called the gut-brain axis, the idea that the bacteria that are living in our gut influence in some way changes to our brain, or they make alterations to our brain. There's actually some really interesting research. It's an emerging field for sure, but there's some really interesting research linking specific organizations of the microbiome with several different issues. For example, mental issues like anxiety or depression. Sometimes there might be a link between an organization of the microbiome and development of autism. That is a possibility. Other developmental issues, those show up depending on different organizations of the microbiome. You can have neonatal or fetal neurological developmental issues that can show up. We've even talked about how the gut microbiome can influence states of hunger. So you may feel in your mind, say, that you really are craving that chocolate bar, or you really are craving something salty, but that can also emerge out of the gut microbiome. It sends a signal up to your brain and says, hey, you actually want to have this sugary or salty snack, and so they can influence our brain that way. So that's a really cool, like I mentioned, emerging field, and it's a major point here that the bacteria, instead of just influencing how we digest things, or instead of influencing just our immune system, there's some really cool and emergent research that suggests that the gut microbiome actually plays a big role in terms of our mental states and even our mental development. Okay, so that's really cool. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about is that while we spend a lot of time thinking about, oh, this is how our microbiome influences us, we should probably spend a little bit of time talking about how it influences other organisms, because as it turns out, we are not the only animals on the planet Earth. It turns out that bacteria, obviously, and we've talked a little bit about this, but it should be obvious that bacteria, in addition to influencing us, they also influence tons and tons of other animals. And so a really interesting question could be, if bacteria influence our own mental states, like we mentioned a second ago, they can be associated with depression or anxiety or what have you, or specific cravings. If they influence our own moods and our own mental states, it is possible then that microbiomes of different organisms can influence their mental states, or how their brains develop. Okay, so that's a really interesting thought experiment, and a really interesting question that a lot of researchers are figuring. How is it that these bacteria and organisms are interplaying with their microbiome, and how are those microbiomes influencing the mental states of these other animals? Now, there's a group out of University of East Anglia, and what they were doing is they were looking at the influence of bacteria on a series of aquatic snails. And specifically, this is an aquatic snail called L. stagnalis. Apparently, this is a freshwater snail. I don't know much about snails, but this is apparently a freshwater snail that's used as a common model organism for snail research, I suppose. You can also use them as pets. So if you ever have a nice little aquarium and you need some aquatic snails, some freshwater aquatic snails to fill up said personal aquarium, you could always grab yourself a nice batch of L. stagnalis. They subsist on vegetables and they eat algae. They also like to eat carrots, which is going to show up in a second. But anyway, so these folks were looking at L. stagnalis, and they were, again, looking to see is it possible for bacteria to influence mental aspects of this snail. Now, specifically what they were wanting to look at was memory. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in a second. But I want to jump into what their actual experiment was. Because what they did is, instead of typically how this sort of thing works is, you'll be like, oh, okay, let's see if this specific bacteria causes this specific type of readout in the organism. Or let's say, let's replace this microbiome with another microbiome, and let's see if that influences the organism in some way. But what they wanted to do, the way that they were approaching this research, is they were approaching it from the perspective of antibiotics. And instead, how does removing bacteria influence the mental states of L. stagnalis? And the reason why actually has to do with a current environmental problem that we're having right now, right? Because it turns out that you and I, or hopefully not us quite so much, but humanity as a whole is using a lot of antibiotics, right? And a lot of those antibiotics, after they are used, or if they are unused and then like flushed down the toilet, or if they're just washed down the drain or something like this, all those antibiotics will run into fresh water. They'll run into the ocean, they'll run into lakes, right? They'll run into fresh water. And so what happens is that there are going to be these localized regions where there are elevated levels of antibiotics. Okay? Now that's kind of interesting, but it becomes less interesting and a little bit more alarming when you realize that the runoff with these antibiotics is going to be influencing the microbiomes of organisms, including something like L. stagnalis. Okay, so what the researchers were doing is they looked at these localized concentrations of antibiotics in the water, right? And then what they did is they put L. stagnalis into a tank that had that same level of antibiotic. Okay, and what they were doing is they were saying, okay, is this going to influence the microbiome of these snails? Okay, so that's how the experiment worked. They hit the snails with an antibiotic concentration that is found at similar levels in their own kind of fresh water. Now, as I mentioned, they were focusing in on memory. And so they went about doing this memory test on snails. So what they did is they gave snails carrot juice. And as it turns out, snails are huge fans of carrot juice. If you give a little bit of carrot juice to a snail, then a snail's going to like snail over and then drink the carrot juice or whatever it is. But what they did is they gave these snails access to carrot juice that had this little slightly toxic chemical in it, right? And so in theory, what should happen is if a snail goes over, tries the carrot juice, tastes that it's slightly toxic, then they shouldn't go back. They should stay away from the juice, right? But what's really interesting is that if you had a normal L. stagnalis in a totally clean set of water, right, gave them the toxic carrot juice, then they would never go back to the carrot juice again. They'd be like, okay, that's a gross bit of carrot juice. It has some kind of toxic compound in it, and then they leave, right? But if you grew snails in the presence of antibiotics, right, where the antibiotics were killing or at least manipulating the composition of the microbiome of these snails, the snails could not remember to stay away from the toxic carrot juice. So not only would they go a first time and taste it and be like, oh, that's gross, and then leave, they would turn around and go back to the carrot juice again and try it again and again and again, right? And so what that means then is that because the antibiotic concentration was high enough to start manipulating with the composition of the snail microbiome, the alterations of that snail microbiome was influencing the actual memory-making capabilities of the snail. It was messing with their memory. Now, the researchers then, they jumped a little bit deeper into this. They found, of course, that the antibiotics were altering the composition of the microbiomes of these snails, and that removing specific types of bacteria was influencing the ability for these snails to make and maintain memories. There were specific bacteria that are associated with healthy memory formation in snails and honestly in other mammals, including humans, actually. And those specific bacteria were getting taken away over the course of this antibiotic treatment. Okay, that's really, really sad, because that means that, especially in these localized areas of runoff where the antibiotic concentration is high enough, there's going to be whole populations of snails that are unable to learn and form memories, and that's going to make a huge, huge deal in terms of how they navigate and succeed and adapt in their environment. Okay, so let's bring this all home together. First of all, we talked about how there's a really strong link between our microbiomes and our brain and how our brains function. That's the first point, the so-called gut-brain axis. We talked about how similarly, just as our microbiomes can influence our brains, the microbiomes of other organisms, including snails, can influence the brains of snails and other organisms, right? We talked about how there's this group out of, I got to remember the name again, University of East Anglia, and what they did is they put snails in the presence of antibiotics in water that had antibiotics that were similar to antibiotic runoff, the normal concentrations of antibiotics in their water supply. And then we found in the final point that the snails that had these antibiotics had a really hard time forming any actual memory because of the alteration of the microbiome composition due to the presence of the antibiotics. If there's one thing that I learned from this paper, and hopefully you guys learned as well, is that we need to do much, much better as being stewards of the earth and being a lot more intentional about the way that we're disposing our antibiotics. We have to be careful about the impact that we have on other creatures on the environment, ranging from the large to the small snail. And this is obviously just one example of this. But that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much, every one of you, for tuning in today. And I hope I'll see you guys again next week on another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria.